Okay, good afternoon. In front of you, you see a picture of the state capitol in Austin, Texas, where I was recently for a film festival. And I'll just talk very briefly about there's a bill called House Bill 5510 in the Texas legislature. There are various versions of it in the Senate being considered this week, which would create illegal liability to bounty hunter lawsuits to people who provide information on abortion pills from out of state to Texas residents, even on websites or blogs or emails. Even it's kind of unclear exactly how great their liability risk would be, but it's something to follow very closely, and I'll probably have to talk about it later in more detail when it's clearer what's going to happen. But I just wanted to make you aware of that, and I'll provide a link in the description. And then the other thing is this is a copy of my trust. I think I've seen it before, just the heading of my trust. And I wanted to talk a little bit about just wrapping up the comments from the gender ideology discussion from Sunday, some loose ends. One thing I left out talking about selective service registration, the law still says male citizens or something like that in a certain age range. I think they took out the discussion of transgenderism that they used to have before, but no, claiming transgender status would not get you out of having to register for selective service. Still wouldn't. Biological males have to register, and there's not very much that's going on right now to repeal it or to force females to register or maybe to repeal it registration altogether. It doesn't seem like there's much going on right now. And I had intended to mention that last time. And it's in the notes from the last um, posting. Um, I also was looking over how, what my own take was on these issues. And I wound up saying that you should only present this stuff in public school once people have had biology. Maybe you would want to back that down in the middle school and be able to teach more about biology in seventh and eighth grades and teach more about government and what the Constitution means. So you could talk about this a little more. But that would mean you couldn't do social transition either. But if you're not going to allow gender affirming care of any kind, it would, if you allowed social transition, it would create a problem in senior high school. At the very least need to have separate single use locker rooms and single use showers and bathrooms and everything for phys. It would create a real problem for phys ed. And it, um, so it doesn't seem, even though the left still insists on supporting it, Trump, of course, as you know, um, in January wanted to deny federal funds from school systems that still provide it. It sounds like very, very difficult thing to support and to do. And I, I would also add, that all the rules about government IDs and everything. Personally, I don't see why an adult that's fully transitioned shouldn't be allowed to use the new sex ID if they're absolutely fully transitioned, maybe with some sort of asterisk or something in case there's a medical emergency. But I personally think that ought to be okay. So, um, but I just wanted to also underscore my concern with, I mentioned HRC Human Rights Campaign being a beneficiary, and there's just too much conflation with the issues of gay people in general and trans people, particularly trans youth. And the problem is I'm in retirement. I have inherited money, and some of it I can use. December 22nd, I made a post explaining how my trust works, and you can go back and read that. But a lot of times, people, when they have an estate, they're expected to support others or to support the causes of the people that they named as beneficiaries, or that the person who had passed away wanted them to support. They're not supposed to use their own thinking and try to overrule joining an effort to make some sort of political change for some sort of equity in society just with their own critical thinking. They're supposed to join up and not insist on their own views being held or heard. And I've certainly not been willing to go along with that. And so I've kind of decided that we'll see what happens with the case in the Tennessee about the gender affirming care, which sounds like SCOTUS is likely to agree with the state. But if there's not some kind of, if I don't hear something from HRC by the summer, by July, I might have to remove them from the beneficiary list, and that would be an expensive procedure. But I'm quite concerned about the fact that they would expect me to support involving the kids. Essentially, my attitude was always, you don't go after the kids, and what adults do is fine. And also, it's age 19 now in Trump's rules. It's up 18 for some reason. But I was never willing to get involved in supporting radical material for kids. I remember noticing after we started coming back from the pandemic, and finally, we finally had Pride again in the DC area in 2022. That the atmosphere was a lot gentler, and there was a lot more attention to youth and parents and the drag queen story hour, and having and the idea of portraying, changing the opinions that young people have about gender roles, so that just cut down on the bullying and so forth. But the tone of how the community had changed, it was sort of feminized in some ways compared to what it had been before the pandemic, at least in some places. And I noticed that, and after we came out of the pandemic, 2021 and particularly in 2022. But so my own experience with this whole idea of ableism, I was way behind athletically, as I've explained, and the explanation might have been the measles when I was going in the summer before second grade. It might have been the measles might have affected me neurologically. And I never really learned to swim. I never learned very well. I started catching up somewhat physically in high school, athletically, compared to what I had been before. But I was surprised in third grade that the teacher made so much of the fact that I was behind, insisted I get with the program rather than allowing me to, which would, what you might be trying to do today is be classified as somehow other in some other category, so to take the pressure off of me and maybe make me more socially acceptable or more so other people would be willing to relate to me, make the world less competitive, less about proving your fitness or something, um, as it was then. That was very much the world then when I was growing up in the 50s and 60s. We had the World War II, the Korean War, we'd have the Vietnam War draft and student deferments, and smarts could get you out of the draft to some extent, but I wound up in the Army and in special education, in special training, that is special training. And I had to deal with this. And to some extent, I succeeded. I did get some support. But now they would want me to be classified legally differently because of my personality traits, which might have been caused by something inherited or something epigenetic, or maybe even the measles, which we didn't have a vaccine for that. And it isn't always, I was considered a little bit autistic too. it isn't always just, it isn't really, I just don't really believe that gender identity as such, as some sort of spiritual entity really exists, that you can base the law, yet they don't allow questioning of it because it feels like the entire benefit of protection for trans people would fall apart if people didn't believe in it, especially for youth. And then they might come after gay men, in a second round of this. It seems like right now Trump is going along with the idea of GLB without the T, but maybe that won't hold forever. The pressure from Orban and Hungary to not allow any discussion of non-conforming sex at all in public. And I'm not sure what's going on with the protests and what's going to happen with our pride. They're going to try to have it anyway. I don't know how that's going to turn out. But that's kind of what I just wanted to update you on. Um, so, yeah, I think I covered essentially everything. So, I just wanted to, to just talk a little bit more about the fact that, I am at odds with one of the beneficiaries and things will have to change by the summer, where I really couldn't continue keeping them as a beneficiary. I just can't get involved with supporting a speculative philosophy for the kids. And it's only been around about 10 years. I used to go to picnics like Fairfax County Public Schools, even though I stopped substitute teaching. And there'd be one or two trans people, probably over 21, and 100 people at the picnic. That was perfectly normal. And when I went to an event in 2022, I was thrown out of the room for not agreeing with them. So something had radically changed. So the other thing is the whole idea in some ways, trans activist ideology in some ways can be homophobic because if you try to convince kids that they should change their identity and then have physical changes to their bodies to correspond, that's a kind of conversion therapy on its own, sort of pharmaceutical conversion therapy, as Joe Rogan said to Vance. I don't think that the HRC wanted us to protest that new HHS letter about allowing talk therapy for children that were gender nonconforming to help them conform, that's conversion therapy. But I don't think it is under the circumstances when you add everything up and how difficult it would be ethically to allow children, to consider themselves as labeled differently. I mean, there's kind of no way around it. Some kids are at a disadvantage when compared to other kids as to how well they can compete, if you want to use the word, according to their biological sex. And then if there's no DSD or no apparent physical explanation, of course, if there is an explanation, you should treat it as best you can medically. But whatever is appropriate for that condition. But if there's no explanation, they have to struggle more, like I did, and prove that they can come up to speed. And I eventually did in the Army and special training. I eventually had to. And they might have to do this kind of thing. I'm not going to apologize for having to say that. But that's just what I wanted you to get today. And again, we'll keep track of that Texas bill. And we have to watch it carefully. Thank you for listening.